just a reminder, today is a 2-hour session that we'll have, and we'll begin, the IRSTE research group will begin with a project on parenting, parent education. So I'm going to begin. This is our, first let me talk a little bit about, this is the title of our talk, Surveying Suzuki Parents, What They've Learned, What They Like, and What They Wish They Knew. And before we delve into that, I'd just like to talk a little bit about what is the International Research Symposium on Talent Education. And to say that it's both an event that usually happens before the SAA conference, and we've had a number of presenters that, I'm getting ahead of myself here, a number of keynoters such as Robert Duke, Laurel Trainer, Robert Cudietta, Patricia Flowers have all been keynote speakers at our conference, and we're even on our evaluation, we will ask you for your ideas. And we want to thank you for joining us for this first time online. So we have an event, but we're also a research group. We have had various teams over the 30 years that have led several research projects. And we, as I mentioned, we have a bibliography of Suzuki-related scholarly research on our, and resources on our webpage. We have this year's, over the years, we've had a number of people. Our team has fluctuated between 3 people and 5 or 6 people working on various research projects. This year, for this project, we have 3 of us. My colleagues are Kate Einerson and Yoon Cho. So just to give you a little bit of context for our research, in 2012, we did a student empathy and pro-social behavior study. In 2014, we did one on teacher demographics and training. And the summary of that is in a 6-part article series on our webpage, and that was also in the American Suzuki Journal. And then in 2016, we interviewed parents about parent education and needs, and followed by an initial survey of parents. So we did an interview study, and then from that interview study, we did a survey, put together a survey. Today, what we're going to talk about is a second and third, a second survey about parents and their experiences and values and preferences. So that's the one that we'll be talking about now. You can maybe go ahead, Yoon. I think I'm one ahead of you there. There we go. There were 2 cohorts. Okay, so let me read from the slide. It says, one way to assess parents' experiences, needs is to ask them, and so we did. We had this interview study that I already mentioned. We used those findings to develop a parent survey, and we presented that at the IRSTE in 2018. And then we had survey 1, which was 57 parents from the studio of active SAA teacher trainers. And then from that, we surveyed over 200 parents in 2018 and 19. These were 30 questions about family demographics, the structure and content of their parent orientation program, if they had any, and the methods of communication, types of materials, and topics they found most helpful and interesting. In survey 2, which took place in 2018, we had 151 SAA-involved parents. These were parents that we solicited from parents as partners registrants. And then survey 3 was an additional 74 parents from online communities, and we want to thank especially Christine Goodner, Paula Bird, and Alan Duncan in advertising for us about our survey. So in total, we had 225 parents completed the 2 surveys. You'll see that our Suzuki families are more educated, more affluent, and more musical than average. So if you look at, we have, for example, 31% who had bachelor's degrees and master's degrees. There were 36% of the families. And we had 29% of households who earned greater than 150,000, and 41% of the families had taken early childhood music lessons or a class, not necessarily though SECE. And that want to make sure you know that our questions were not mandatory, so people could, for example, choose to report their income or not. So the data that we're showing here consists only of the proportions of respondents of any given question or given item. Okay, now we're going to talk about communication, what they preferred in how they wanted to be communicated with. And we found this to be very interesting. Outside of lessons, people preferred to talk to their teacher by email, text message, and phone call, or be communicated with. And their less preferred ways were by studios or school newsletter, social media, or online discussion groups. And this is interesting because we felt that the first set, the email, the text message, and the phone call, and of course lesson conversations is the most preferred way, that those can have flexible timing and are asynchronous instead of being in real time. So for example, like a phone call would have to be in real time, but the email and text message could be anytime, and the parent has a record. The other interesting thing about these methods of communication that are preferred is that we check to see across age and all the demographics, there was no significant differences in their preferences. So it didn't matter whether these were younger teachers or younger parents, older parents, more affluent, less affluent, or more educated. These were their preferences across all of those demographics. And even there was no difference between the people that found our survey online as opposed to those who didn't find it online. So as opposed to the parents as partners people, even those did not prefer the online discussions. Okay, as far as resources, you can see here lesson notes, Suzuki book, recordings, streaming, audio, video. These are convenient and they can be customized to the child, to the family. The resources that were not specific were those that were likely, that were not specific or close at hand and were less likely to be used. So books about Suzuki, teacher handouts, these you can see have diminishing preference as opposed to those things that are more targeted to the needs of the child or parent and or family. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Yoon Cho, who will continue the presentation.
Okay, so as Pat mentioned earlier, out of 225 respondents, 41% took pre-instrumental music training, so any type of early childhood music program. And of that 41%, more than 2/3 took Suzuki-specific classes, such as SECE. In terms of initial parents' orientation, about 60% said that their studio offered parent orientation when their child first started a Suzuki lesson. So the red color here indicates that almost 40% were not offered with any parent orientation. For those who had the orientation, the sessions were most commonly like about 45 minutes to an hour, but many were even shorter than that. Of the parents who had initial orientation, almost half did not have parent-child instrumental lessons. So as you can see the red color here, but actually many of them would have liked to have the lessons. In terms of the topics discussed in the orientation, a large number of parents said that topics like Suzuki philosophy, instrumental technique and care, effective home practice and environment, and child learning and development were covered, and they were quite satisfied with them. Opportunities for ongoing parents' education were less common. As you can see, this red color indicates that no ongoing parents' education was available. And the two blue color ones are those who had ongoing parents' education. But the light blue indicates only once or twice a year, so not a lot. And the purple shows that parents' education was ongoing, but they did not participate. So this kind of shows a lack of ongoing parents' education opportunities in general, but this also calls us to think about how we can help parents engage in ongoing parents' education, even if we offer those opportunities. And yeah, and like half of the parents said that their studio or program offered parent-to-parent support, parent-to-parent to support opportunities, and the most common form was in-person in-person parent discussion group, followed by online parent discussion group, parent mentoring, and others. But you know, this survey was done before the COVID-19, so things might be different now. We also asked how many days that parents practiced it with their child and listened to Suzuki recordings at home. And the responses varied, but we found a significant correlation between these two. So in other words, parents who practice it with their child more tended to listen more, vice versa. Next, we asked how confident the parents felt overall as their child home teacher. And they turned out to be quite confident. So as 75% said they were somewhat or very confident as a home teacher. Then we asked how confident they were in 8 different issues. The numbers here indicate the mean score from out of 5. So as you see, the parents were quite confident in all these issues. And these were issues that they were somewhat less confident, but still not so bad. And next is about the things that the parents felt challenging. So these issues were something that the parents felt challenging. Again, the numbers are the mean score from out of 5. But interestingly, we asked the same question in our very first survey back in 2016, and the results between this survey and the 2016 one were very consistent. So the mean scores were very similar, and the order of each issue were exactly the same. So we guess that a lot of Suzuki parents commonly face these challenges. We also ran an analysis to see if their confidence and challenges had any relationships. And we found that most logistic challenges were not correlated with their confidence, but several practice-related issues were. So for example, parents who felt challenged to keep their child engaged in practice, make time in the family schedule for practice, and help their child progress tended to have lower levels of confidence as a home teacher. And this may not be surprising, but it's nice to see that parents who were more confident reported practicing with their child more frequently at home. So parents who were somewhat or very confident as their child home teacher clustered on more than 5 days of practicing at home. So although we cannot tell any causality here because this is correlations, this seems to suggest the importance of parents' role as home teacher. Now Kate will take over and share more results.
Hello, I'm Kate Enerson, and I'll step in here. As you mentioned, we don't know what the causal relationship is between the parents' confidence ratings and days of practice, but we do know that the two are related. So we did a bit more digging in our data about parents' reported confidence levels to see if we could figure out some of the driving factors underneath this. Perhaps unsurprisingly, parents who told us that they had studied music at a high level or majored in music were more confident on every single confidence question we asked. So the overall question, as well as all 8 specific subdomains. So we kept looking for other differences. And one of the few that we found was that overall younger parents, which in this sample meant people younger than age 36, were generally more confident in the areas of creating a learning environment at home, in their ability to carry out the teacher's instructions, and helping their child make progress. We haven't unpacked yet whether that might be related to the fact that these children are younger and are encountering slightly different challenges given that their parents are younger. But there seems to be something going on where these younger parents have more confidence. Specifically, we also dug into some of the ratings about what sorts of things parents at home found challenging. We did find patterns here too. So again, parents who had extensive musical training generally felt less challenged to keep their child engaged, to manage distractions and interruptions, to understand and remember the teacher's instructions, and to help their child make progress. We thought that mapped well onto the types of questions we'd asked, specific to music expertise or the nitty-gritty of making practice at home on a day-to-day basis, where musically trained parents might have some skills that would help them in those domains. That said, when we dug a little deeper, parents who reported having a master's degree or a doctoral degree in any field said that they were more challenged to keep their child engaged at home and to help their child progress. And again, we can't explore these data, but there seems to be something going on with these higher education levels where these are challenges that were reported in our sample. There. Lastly, perhaps this is not a surprise, but families with higher income did report significantly less struggle specific to affording the cost of lessons. However, there was a trade-off there where those families were significantly more likely to struggle with making time specifically for group lessons, perhaps in busy schedules in high SES homes. And then we got into the question that we had been most interested to explore, which was whether the effects of parent education and orientation made a difference in these more granular ratings that we asked parents to make. We thought perhaps parents who'd had very comprehensive initial education experiences or who had ongoing orientation and enrichment available to them in their programs might be more confident or might feel less challenged. Interestingly, when we looked at both those groups of parents, so both the groups of parents who had initial parent education of some kind when starting out with their child, and parents who had access to ongoing opportunities, we didn't find significant difference in confidence ratings or in challenge ratings between parents in either of those two groups. So that was an unexpected finding for us, and we're quite intrigued, in fact. So Pat has walked you through some of the descriptive data about who these parents were, what they told us they liked, what they told us they found most helpful, and then Yoon has shared with you some of the descriptions of the things that they find challenging or the things that they're confident about. So what we take away from this is that parent education alone cannot and does not account for variations in parents' confidence or their competence. And I'll just remind you that initial Suzuki orientation for parents was pretty widespread in this sample. About 2/3 of parents got some kind of onboarding orientation experience. There were fewer options available for any kind of ongoing parent education for parents who are in studios. And based on our challenge data, I think it's important, particularly for the teachers who are joining us today, to think about the fact that parents told us that some of their challenges had to do with ongoing day-to-day issues like practicing at home. Those might be well supported by ongoing parent education that not all parents have access to. That said, more families also reported opting out of those ongoing opportunities, perhaps due to the time crunch that we saw some parents reporting. And again, that lack of significant difference in either the confidence ratings or the ratings of what was challenging suggests that this relationship between how we orient parents to their role as home teacher and then how they carry out that role and how they feel about it is more complex than a direct one-to-one causal relationship. We have a couple reasons we think might be contributing to this. One is that the structure and the duration that parents told us their parent education took was really variable. Some people got one 45-minute session, some people got 8 to 12-hour-long sessions over the course of many weeks. So it's hard to draw conclusions when there's that much variability in what's being offered. Additionally, there seemed to be some variation in the content of what was covered. So there really is no standard best practice for Suzuki teachers about what that orientation experience looks like. And then again, maybe knowing something is not the same as doing something. And the pedagogues in the room will know that this is true. So declarative knowledge is not the same thing as procedural knowledge. We can tell parents these things in an education session, but it could be that they're not getting what they need to make a difference at home or to impact their practice in ways that we can measure in this survey. And finally, we didn't restrict the people who could fill out this survey. So some of them were veteran Suzuki parents who'd been at this for a decade or more, and they were filling out this survey based on their recollections of things from a long time ago. So we had very young students and young parents, but also more established parents of older students. And there is a question of whether the things they were telling us were reliable after so much time, and whether they really could drive an effect after so many years of other Suzuki influences. Thanks. So reaching back again to think about this relationship, which in many cases extends quite a few years for families in our studios, I think the data that Pat showed you speak to the fact that teachers need to be strategic about how they communicate with families and how they provide resources and information. So ongoing communication is a key piece of building that relationship between a teacher and a parent. And you'll remember that the pattern we noticed is that parents seem to want communication that's customized to their particular need and their particular child. And they want it to be convenient, so often asynchronous, but on an as-needed basis. Additionally, that relationship with the teacher unfolds over weeks, months, and years for both the student and the parent. So students will grow and face new challenges in their lessons, which means that parents will face new challenges as their child gets older and acquires new skills. So the needs that the parent has as home teacher and as practice parent will change. And I think that's reflected in the fact that we saw parents reporting they wanted specific support over general resources. So they preferred specific examples of recordings in lessons, for example, as opposed to general books for reference purposes. And again, as Pat mentioned, we didn't actually see differences in preferences for communication based on age or other demographic information. We didn't really expect that parents of all ages would tell us that they dislike or do not use online sources and social media. Again, these are pre-COVID data, so there's been a monumental shift since we collected these data in 2019. But it does speak to the fact that we need to be thoughtful about how parents are getting this information, especially in the current circumstance. So taking this home for you, as Yoon said, parents feel really confident overall. The average score was 4 out of 5. But that said, the patterns in what parents find challenging in their role as home teacher are also consistent across 3 different surveys with more than 300 parents. So confident parents are practicing and listening more often than their less confident peers. But those challenges that parents are facing seem to happen across the board. And specifically, challenges related to the home practice environment and the home practice routine, as well as the logistical constraints of getting to lessons and paying for lessons, seem to be most widespread. But again, it was the practice challenges specific to the home environment that were related most to parent confidence. So to conclude, I think these data show some potential routes to impact for Suzuki teachers in their studio. And they also suggest some next steps for research for people who are working in the field. As Pat pointed out, our respondents are educated and affluent overall. There's a question there of whether the people who responded to our survey are disproportionately educated and affluent relative to the larger Suzuki community, or whether the Suzuki community itself is not representative of the broader population. Regardless, I think those demographic characteristics are likely to inform both the pattern of challenges and the pattern of preferences that we observed in this data set. Again, despite parents' overall confidence as home teacher, many were telling us that they had struggles specifically to do with home practice. And I think a key takeaway for teachers is to be sure to structure lessons in a way that emphasize that at-home modeling and set up opportunities for parents to practice their role as home teacher. Lastly, parents told us they felt supported when they have what they need when they need it. And as I mentioned, there's not really a current best practice or standard practice when it comes to parent education, parent orientation, or ongoing parent support. So we think that future research needs to keep digging into the question of what constitutes a best practice for content, structure, and strategies when we're looking to deliver this education to parents and meet the needs of our studio families. I think with that, we're going to thank a number of people and organizations who were involved in this work. That's right. So thanks to the SAA, the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and ASI, University of Kansas, and the hundreds of families who took part in this work over the past several years. I think we have a few moments for questions now.
Are we supposed to chat the questions?
Unfortunately, I'm the one who types those instructions. Yes, you're welcome to chat the questions, or you can unmute yourself and ask them, whichever you prefer. We ask that people put up their hand if they'd like to speak or submit a question directly into the chat box. Pat, for the sake of keeping things on schedule, I think we could also keep going because we have a full dance card tonight. Ah, yes, Julie, I mean the virtual hand that's at the bottom of the chat box, if you'd like to speak. Apologies, we can't see everybody's video feed at the same time, even if it's on. Pat, I think you're muted.
Okay, I think then if we don't have any questions, we can move on to our next presentation, and this will be John Ryan Zabanel, who will talk about the effects of different instrumental accompaniment on intonation of high school and collegiate violinists, violists, and cellists. Take it away, John.
All right, hello, can you hear me nice and loud and clear?
Yes.
All right, excellent. So I'm gonna go.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and share screen and all that other fun stuff. Hello, my name is John Ryan Zabanel, and I am the assistant professor and director of string music ed at Vandercook College of Music right here in Chicago, Illinois. So I'm gonna talk to you about a research project that I've done pre-COVID, considering that it involves interactions with people. So moving on. So real quickly, a brief review of literature. There's been a lot of studies done on intonation and temperament, specifically with listener and performer preferences. And what I mean by that, I mean, there's a whole bunch of temperaments in Western music. We have equal temperament and Pythagorean and just intonation and all that other fun stuff. So listener preferences, it's really instrument specific. For example, there was a study done on ascending and descending scales where pianists who listened to the scales preferred equal temperament, whereas violinists who listened to those scales preferred those tuned to Pythagorean intonation.
Excuse me, John, is there a way to increase your volume? People got a comment that you're very soft.
Okay, let me try.
Maybe just speak closer to the microphone or something.
How about I raise the volume up and everything?
There you go. That's great.
All right, very good. Go back a few slides. Then we go to performer preferences. I mean, we as string players, there's a lot of literature in the pedagogy that says that we try to perform in Pythagorean, and that's not necessarily true. The research has been actually very inconclusive about which temperament do we actually tune in. There's some that tends to go towards equal temperament and some that go towards Pythagorean. Then there's a lot of information on improving intonation, which is a subsequent slide. So now we have sources of tuning stimulus, and what I mean is when you're tuning something, where does the source come from? Does it come from an electronic source or from an acoustic source? In relation to wind instrumentalists, there's been higher accuracy of tuning to an oboe or a tuba compared to an electronic source. A more recent study with high school wind musicians said that they preferred, when they were asked which stimulus do you prefer to tune to, they preferred to tune to the tuba, but they were more accurate with oboe, clarinet, and flute. And they did a replication study on collegiate wind musicians who also preferred tuba, but it didn't matter which instrument or source the stimuli came from, they were all the same, they all tuned well. Specifically towards strings, there was a study done on middle school string students who tuned to an open A and to an acoustic, who tuned an open A string to an acoustic or electric source. And there was no significant difference between the two. For those particular middle school students, it was about the same. And with high school students, there was a study done on a pure tone, like a sine tone, or a complex triangle form tone, or a sawtooth waveform. And again, there was no significant difference. We know a lot of techniques to help improve intonation. So string pedagogues recommend playing with a piano accompaniment, duets with a teacher and a student, do double stops with open strings, or tune with a drone accompaniment. Actually, there's a lot of string musicians do use a drone accompaniment to help improve their intonation. But current research, and there hasn't been a lot regarding using drone accompaniments to improve performance, is actually relatively inconclusive. So again, it's what Kate said earlier. They're the practices that we do, and then there's the practices that we do, and does it work? Anecdotally, yes, it works, but with the current evidence, it's inconclusive. But we do know that accompaniment does appear to positively affect pitch acuity. So when you're playing with the piano accompaniment, it helps to bring your intonation a little bit more together. So the purpose of the present study was to examine the effects of different instrumental accompaniments on the intonation of violinists, violists, and cellists in a melodic context. And a little backstory, I don't know about you, but in my past when I was playing duets with wind instrumentalists, I found myself adjusting my intonation with the wind instrumentalists a lot more than I would adjust with my string colleagues. I didn't know why I experienced this, but I just did. Even asking my other string folks, hey, do you find yourself changing intonation, adjusting it more with wind folks? They said, yeah. So I just wanted to investigate, all right, is this actually happening, or is it all in my head? So my research questions were, are there differences in tuning accuracy of melodic content between accompanied and unaccompanied conditions among string musicians? Are there differences in tuning accuracy of melodic content between accompaniment octaves? Are there differences in intonation accuracy between string, oboe, and piano accompaniments? Are there differences between the number of flat, sharp, and in-tune responses of participants? Are there differences in string musicians' preference between accompaniment types? So I'm not only measuring their actual intonation, I'm asking which accompaniment type do you prefer? Are there differences in string musician perception of intonation between accompaniment types? And are there differences between age and experience of participants in intonation accuracy with the various accompaniment types? So I had recorded solo recordings of Ferjaka on the solo cello, oboe, piano, and the violin. I chose this piece because most classically trained musicians are familiar with this tune, and it was used in previous studies. And I decided to use E flat major so that all the string instrumentalists, they had to use their fingers instead of using open strings, so I can measure the intonation and to see if they adjusted the pitch on their fingers. Recordings were made with graduate students working on a terminal degree on their primary instrument. We had multiple recordings of each performance, and the performer, myself, and the recording specialists, we listened to all the multiple recordings until we were satisfied with a particular recording. The top recordings on each instrument were selected for the stimuli, and I actually went a step further. All recordings were auto-tuned to produce versions of the files that contain pitches deviating no more than plus or 6 cents from equal temperament. Why equal temperament instead of Pythagorean theorem? A lot of the current research uses equal temperament as a baseline for intonation studies. So I'm just following the vein there. So I recorded cello, oboe, piano, and violin stimuli, and I created multiple orders right here. All listening tracks with stimulus accompaniments and a pre-recorded instructions were created for each order. Order D was really interesting when I was listening to the high school students. Some of them weren't quite flat enough in E flat, so they were very surprised when they got to the violin, and that will be a limitation for later on. So like I said, one of the research questions were about the most preferred and least preferred, so I distributed a survey after they recorded their performances and asked them this question. And I also asked them to rate their tuning accuracy for each performance of the listed condition below. And I had with the cello, with the oboe, with the violin as a solo, I think, oh, and with the piano. Participants of the procedure, participants entered the room. I had recording equipment attached. Participants were given a 2-minute practice period. And a lot of the graduate students, they didn't really feel like they really needed to practice. So they were given the opportunity to use the practice period if they wanted to. Between each performance, I had them listen to a 15-second excerpt of this piece by Schoenberg. And the intention of that was to block tonal memory between the stimuli conditions. So here's what it sounded like. So 15 seconds of that between each performance. So there's Ferjaka. I decided to analyze the pitches within these boxes. And I selected Ferjaka because the first measure, you see that the measures are repeated every other measure. So the first time could be like a warm up, and then hopefully the second time they played it, it would be a little bit more accurate or they adjusted. So I decided to select these four boxes to analyze. So wave audio recordings of participant performance were analyzed using software Tony. Directional cent deviations were collected, then converted to absolute cent deviations. And then only absolute cent deviation means were used for the notes E, G, E flat, G, A flat, and B flat in selected measures. The reason for that was because for notes like C and, I forget the other one right now. C and F, they only occurred once, and I wanted to be able to average the notes together. So E flat occurred 5 times, and I could average those together to see if they've adjusted. Oh yeah, and there it is. So this is the audio software that I use. You can see the contour for Ferjaka that they recorded. I'm going to share an excerpt of their performance right now.
Cello.
So you could hear the cello in the background. The way I had it set up was I had a pickup mic literally next to their F holes, so they will only pick up as much of the frequencies coming out of the instrument and not from the accompaniment figure. So participants, I had a total of 103 string musicians. Yes, I listened to Ferjaka 515 times. There were 55 violinists, 22 violists, and 26 cellists. I had high school participants and collegiate participants. They were from 2 area high schools, and there's some demographic information regarding grade level. Their mean age was 16 years, and their reported years of performing experience on their primary instrument ranged from 2 to 13 years with an average of 6.63. For collegiate participants, I had 43, 31 undergraduates and 12 graduates, performance majors, 25, 11 music ed majors, and other included music therapy, music theory, music history. Mean age was 22.63 years. Reported years of performing experience on their primary instrument range from 5 to 32. So results, I conducted a 4-way ANOVA to determine if there was a significant difference within subject variables, so accompaniment type between violin, cello, solo, piano, and oboe accompaniments, and note deviations, and between subject variables, level participants, so high school and collegiate, and their primary instrument. Significant main effects were found between the accompaniment conditions, cello, oboe, piano, and violin, solo, and significant differences were found using pairwise comparisons. So just to describe this, that means students had less cent deviations performing with the oboe accompaniment, and they were most out of tune playing as a solo relative to equal temperament. These bar lines over here represent significant differences. So there was a significant difference between pretty much all instruments except for piano and solo. But there was only a significant difference between the oboe and the piano. So even though the oboe had fewer cent deviations than the violin and cello, it wasn't significant enough to warrant a big difference, whereas oboe and piano was significant. Significant main effect was found between cent deviations of analyzed notes. So these are the notes that I analyzed. E flat, the tonic, was more in tune than A flat, A flat, the predominant, and then B flat, the dominant, was also more in tune than A flat. And there was no significant difference between the notes and the third G. A significant main effect was also found for between subject factor level participants. So high school participants had a higher cent deviation than collegiate participants, which is good because we like to think that our college folks are more in tune than our high school folks. No main effect was found for the between subject factor of instruments. So the violinists, violists, and cellists were not more or less in tune than the other. So put away those viola jokes. They are played more in tune than the violin and the cello folks. So I also wanted to see pitch tendency. So a lot of the research says that instrumentalists tend to play sharp compared to in tune or flat intonation. So with high school students, I found that they had more sharp pitches than in tune than flat pitches. So there's the pitch response for each condition, and the highlighted numbers are, the highlighted rows are significant differences. So for the cello, oboe, violin, and so there were significant differences between flat, in tune, and sharp, whereas piano, they weren't as significant. And you can see that in the percentages right here. I did the same thing with collegiate folks. You can see that they have more in tune pitches than flat and sharp, which is good, considering their music majors, but they still had more sharp responses than flat notes, which I also found very interesting. And there were significant differences between all conditions. So that was actual intonation. Now we're going to the preferred accompaniment. So I asked them which accompaniment did they prefer. So there was a significant difference between participants' ranking of the 4 accompaniment conditions. And here's the results for that. They all preferred the cello, and they least preferred the oboe. And there was a significant difference between these pairings. So overall, there was a significant difference between all the top 3 instruments compared to the oboe, which was interesting because we saw from actual accompaniment scores, actual intonation scores, they performed most in tune with the oboe and least in tune as a solo and cello. So I just found it interesting that they preferred the cello over the oboe, yet they were still more in tune playing with the oboe. Perceived intonation, so I asked them to rank their perceived intonation between for each accompaniment. stimuli. A three-way ANOVA was conducted to calculate if there was a significant difference in perceived intonation ratings between accompaniment type, level participants, and primary instruments. Significant main effect was found between level participants. So high schoolers thought they were less in tune than college folks, which could indicate some sort of confidence issues in terms of playing as a solo. No main effect was found between primary instrument of participants. No significant interaction was found between primary instrument of the participants and their level. So here's a perceived score. So again, before they said that they preferred to play with the cello, and they also thought that they performed more in tune with the cello. They least preferred to perform with the oboe, and they also thought that they were less in tune performing with the oboe. So just a review, if that was a lot with all the data. So here's a simplified version. Are there differences in tuning accuracy of melodic content between accompanied and unaccompanied conditions? Participants performed with higher step deviations performing as a solo compared to their performance with oboe, violin, cello accompaniments. Additionally, participants performed more in tune with the oboe accompaniment than with the piano accompaniment. Again, even though the oboe had the least cent deviations, there were only significant difference with comparing the oboe and the piano accompaniment. Are there differences in tuning accuracy of melodic content between accompaniment octaves? Nope, there are none. Considering that there were no differences between the instruments and the fact that the cello is performing an octave lower than than the stimuli conditions, there was no significant difference between octaves. Cent deviations of participants were similar regardless of the octave of the accompaniment. Third research question, are there differences in intonation accuracy between string, oboe, and piano accompaniments? A significant main effect was found for accompaniment conditions. However, there was no significant difference between string and non-string accompaniments. So violin, cello, and piano oboe. The only pair of accompaniment conditions that produced significantly different deviations among string musicians was between the oboe accompaniment and the piano accompaniment. Are there differences between the number of flat, sharp, and in-tune responses of participants? Simply put, yes. Are there differences in string musician preference between accompaniment types? Yes. Again, overall, they prefer the cello, and they least prefer the oboe accompaniment. Are there differences in string musicians' perception of intonation between accompaniment types? Yes. String musicians were most in tune with, this was a minor typo. String musicians believed they were most in tune with the cello. Yes, string musicians believed they were most in tune with the cello and least in tune with the oboe. I apologize for that mess up on the bullets. And are there differences between age and experience of participants in intonation accuracy with various accompaniment types? Yes. High school participants perform with higher mean cent deviations than collegiate participants. So participants achieved less deviation when they performed with an accompaniment compared to performing as a solo, which is consistent to previous research, talking about performing with an accompaniment brings your intonation deviations down a little bit. Participants were most in tune with the oboe accompaniment with significant differences between the oboe and piano and solo condition, providing more evidence that musicians tend to match pitch to the oboe more accurately than to other tuning sources. A tendency to perform with sharp intonation over flat intonation was found among high school and college participants, though high school students had the most sharp responses. This appears to align with the predominant theme that instrumental musicians have a tendency to perform with sharp intonation. Specifically for the high school folks, I just think many of them forgot what E flat was. Specifically if they started with in the order with the solo accompaniment, because then many of them were surprised to hear that they were a whole half step sharp when they started playing with the violin recording. String players prefer to perform with string accompaniments. That's what I basically gathered from this particular study. Why? Perhaps it's familiar with the string timbre. It's rare for schools to have a full symphony orchestra at an elementary or middle school level, and even less than half of high schools offers a full orchestra. Standard small ensemble repertoire involves string quartets. And to the Suzuki world, Suzuki-trained string musicians may be most familiar with string and piano timbre and least familiar with the wind timbre, simply because you're playing with your teacher who's playing the same instrument as you. You're playing in group lessons, which are also similar instruments as you, and you're listening to the Suzuki recordings, which are all piano and violin, if you're listening to a violin recording. Participants preferred the cello accompaniment. Participants preferred to perform with the cello accompaniment, and they believed that their intonation was best with the cello accompaniment, but their intonation was not most accurate with the cello. Another thing could be perhaps string players are trained to tune from the bottom up. For a large ensemble, or maybe tuning with the piano, or maybe tuning with the drone note, a scale with the drone note, you're listening to the tonic, and then you work your way up as you tune the chord or as you tune your scales. Participants' least preferred and least accurate ratings occurred with the oboe accompaniment, even though they performed with less deviation with oboe accompaniment. Musicians frequently confuse timbre and intonation. They might listen to another instrument and think, oh, that's not in tune, but it could be perhaps that's a timbre that they're just not accustomed to. So the difference of timbres between the two instruments may cause string musicians to listen a little bit more closely to the sound, and perhaps they may, I'm not sure, but they may get confused between timbre and intonation, specifically less experienced musicians who may not be used to those particular timbres. High school students were more out of tune than collegiate students. Hopefully this is true all around, wherever we go. High school students rated their intonation more critically than college students. And however, college participants rated their solo intonation as second highest, while high school participants rated as second lowest compared to all other conditions. I just thought that was really interesting. There might be some self-efficacy or some confidence issues that go along with that. Collegiate folks, they're used to performing in a studio or performing in front of an audience, whereas school-age folks, maybe they're not used to performing with an audience. I'd be really interested to see if there were a difference between Suzuki-trained students as opposed to non-Suzuki trained students, considering of all the performances that solo performance that Suzuki-trained students do. Implications: the accompaniment could be used to help improve intonation, which is something that we already do in the pedagogical literature. Oboe accompaniment was least preferred and had the lowest intonation. Perhaps we should expose our students to other instruments of other different timbres. Maybe, I don't know, let's have a recording of an oboe playing Lightly Row or something and having students getting used to that. And the oboe timbre could be used as a drone stimulus for the drone accompaniments. Collegiate participants, so some limitations, some issues that may affect the study. Collegiate participants performed in afternoon, evening, while high school students perform in the morning. There's a lot of research out there that says high school adolescents are not awake that early in the morning. So if I were able to schedule their recordings later in the afternoon, maybe they'd be a little bit more awake and a little bit more responsible, and maybe it would be a little bit more accurate. The choice of E-flat major. Some high school students performed in E major, as I mentioned before, even after being reminded of the key signature and having that warm-up period. And also, due to the nature of the cello fingering, this key involved awkward shifting. Whereas violins and violas, they can stay in first position if you'd like, but cellos, they have to shift between first and fourth. And then set deviations relative to equal temperament. Even though the literature is relatively inconsistent, but leans towards the fact that string players lay towards Pythagorean, maybe if I redid the study and compared their notes to Pythagorean, I would have different results. So that's my study. I'm going to go ahead and stop share. And if there's any questions typed in. Okay, so I see some questions in the chat. Let's see. Was the accompaniment playing the melody or the harmony? It was all the melody. So let's say the cello accompaniment, I had a cello accompaniment and I had a violin student performing. They were playing an octave. What if I had the cello accompaniment and the cello participant, they were playing unison? So that's what I did there. Let's see. Is this study primarily from the U.S.? Yes, I was in Florida when I conducted the study, so all these students were in Florida, though the undergrad and graduate students could be from anywhere in the United States. Sharon Miller, you said that you had 2 questions. not sure if you wanted to speak them out loud or type them in, but I'm happy to answer.
Right, they were too, yeah, it was easier to ask. Could you show the slide again that shows the deviation between, I don't know if you can do this, between the piano accompaniment and the oboe? I think you said that was the largest.
Yes.
Because we use,
well,
yeah, we use piano so much.
Let me find that. They were most out of tune performing as a solo. Here we go, I found it. Let me just go ahead and do this.
And my screen has gone blank. I wonder. Okay, there we go.
So this was the results of the intonation, not their perception. So 0 is perfectly in tune. And when we're looking at these numbers, just know that 5 cents is the just noticeable difference. So we're not going to be able to tell the difference between 0 and cents off, but we start to be able to tell a difference between 0 and 6 cents off. So I'm not sure why the piano was that most out of tune. Here's some ideas. Perhaps it was because, at least for the high school students, maybe they're not accustomed to performing with the piano, so that might have confused them. Another one could be oboe, violin, and cello. They can all sustain a pitch, whereas the piano, they will decay. So there really wasn't much opportunity for the participants to adjust intonation.
Thank you.
So those are my thoughts on that. Any other questions? Well, if there's nothing else, thank you very much for sitting here and listening to me rant about intonation and accompaniment types. Pat, I see your mouth moving, but I don't hear you.
Oh, thank you. I have to remember to unmute. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And I just said, the thought occurred to me that we tuned to the oboe in the orchestra. So I wonder if there's any relationship there. But anyway. Okay, next on our list we have Does the Bow Fit? Anthropomorphic Pometric Measurements and Fractional Sized Violin Bows. And this will be presented by Dr. Zachary Eben and Marie Faith Lane. So I believe you have control of the screen, so take it away.
All right. Can everybody see the slide? That's working? All right, thank you. All right, well, hello everybody. It is so nice to see everybody, and we're certainly missing you all from our every other year gathering in Minneapolis. My name is Zach Eben, and I'm a professor at Vanderbilt University at the Blair School of Music. And my collaborator here is...
My name is Marie Faith Lane, and I just graduated from Vanderbilt.
And just to give you a little bit of a background, this project started from discussions in a pedagogy seminar, and we became very interested in whether fractional size equipment for string players actually makes sense to the bodies of children, or are they just kind of arbitrarily shrunk down. And as a first step, we decided to just focus on bows to see if we could find some sort of logic behind the way fractional size violin bows are constructed, or if they are just short.
To start off our presentation, we want to begin with an activity. So here's a set of 7 student violin bows. Just take about 30 seconds to order the bows from 1 to 7, smallest in size to largest in size. The bow sizes are listed up above, the smallest size being a 16th, then going to a 10th, an 1/8, quarter, half, 3/4, and then the full size bow. All right, so here's the results, just by a show of hands, who got a perfect score. The problem with this is that you can certainly tell the difference between the children of different sizes, but you can't tell the difference in size between these various bow dimensions. The violin bow is the most crucial aspect in violin playing. It's also the most overlooked component when creating the ideal setup for violin students. The majority of attention has been focused on the violin. There have been various devices that have been put forth to determine instrument sizing for students. Altering the violin bow dimensions, so tailoring the proportions of the bow to fit a child's physical limitations, will allow for ease in the right hand. Playing with a bow that is too heavy may lead to overcompensation, and this could cause a student to use any motion or technique they see fit in order to produce sound. If this mindset is prolonged throughout their musical development, it can be crippling and it could cause severe complications to their playing, especially in the right hand technique. The bow allows the string player to achieve the level of artistry that is demanded by the music. Violinists are displaying advanced skills at an ever young age. Christian Lee was one of the winners of the Yehudi Menuhin International Competition for violin students at age 10. Hamari Yoshimuri was awarded the grand prize in the 2019 Grumio International Competition for young violinists at age 7. And this is just naming a couple. As young kids become more advanced, they need better equipment. If the bow is too heavy and clunky, it won't work as well as a well-balanced bow. Because violin students are utilizing more advanced techniques at a younger age, the proper setup is crucial to prevent injury. There is research conducted by Spahn, Struckling, Lehman about health and music students in comparison to other student populations. And what they found was that the high prevalence rates of playing related health problems discovered led to the realization that specific stress on musicians begins in the training phase, long before the start of professional life. Bow sizing and instrument sizing are crucial for injury prevention, most effective in early stages of musical development. So we realized that fractional size violin bows are nearly identical to the dimensions of full size bows, except in the dimension of length. Previous research indicates that the hand size is proportional to growth, regardless of whether the person is a child or an adult. So taking this research into consideration, our research suggests dimensions for fractional size violin bows that align with the proportion of growth, mimicking the function of a full-size violin bow, better suiting a child's size. The bow measurements were taken from a variety of student violin bows from a reputable violin shop in Nashville, Tennessee. And to obtain these dimensions, we used a tape measure, food scale, and calipers. Even though only a few bows were measured, we believe it's a fair representation of the student violin bow population. And as we continue to develop our project, we will be studying other student violin bows. The field of research concerning body measurements and growth is known as anthropometry. Anthropometric research was analyzed and reviewed using data from a variety of authors chosen because they present the norms that have become the standard in this field of research. So here you can see the articles where you can find the norms that we used. And in the next few slides, it includes illustrations of what we measured when obtaining these dimensions. A is the length of the screw to the tip. B is the length of the ferrule to the tip on a flat surface. C is the length of the screw. F is the length at the tip. M is the height of the tip. And J is the width at the tip. G is the width of the ferrule, E is the length of the frog at the bottom, H is the width of the back of the frog, I is the width of the stick at the screw, K is the height of both the frog and the stick at the back of the frog, L is the height of the frog, and D is the length of the frog at the top. So here's a picture of all of the bows that we measured. And from measuring the bows, our results indicated that the dimensions remained the same except in the dimension of length. We found that there were two sizes of frogs, a smaller model and a larger model, but they were not very different. The larger model of the frog was used in the 3/4 and full size bow, and the other bows had the frog that was slightly smaller, but like very minorly so. All of the other dimensions that we discussed above are all the same. The sticks have the same width at the thickest point. The ribbon of the bow hair remains the same width across all bows, and the heights of the bows are all pretty similar. Based on standardized data provided, growth rates have been determined based on age and gender of the child. The arm and growth ratio graph shows the growth ratio of both male and female children. So taking the length of each bone at age 12 in comparison to the average length at each age. The different parts of the arms all approximately grow at the same proportion. Marish data was combined with metacarpal and phalangeal lengths of Nigerian and Japanese children to create these ratios of limb growth. The measurements provided were used based on reliability and availability. Everything grows at the same proportion. It's not like one part of the arm grows a lot when they're little and another part grows a lot when they're older. It all grows in the same proportion. There are limitations to this idea because the data was created by combining two sets of studies and combining two ethnicities of children to determine the rate of growth. The proportions may be distorted and there is potential for the data to be flawed. So here are the hand-arm growth ratios for female children. The ratios comparing the growth of the hand to the growth of the arm were calculated by dividing the total length of the third finger by the length of the radius. These values originated from hand measurements of Nigerian and Japanese children, and the radial lengths came from the Marish reference data. This data shows that both male and female Nigerian and Japanese children grow proportionally. In general, the hand tends to be a little bit bigger at the early stages, but very minorly so. But the relation of the size of the hand to the size of the arm stays approximately the same. Based on the approach of the way the bow design is currently manufactured, we should see children with abnormally large hands. For the part of the bow that children actually hold, there is little to no difference at that part of the bow in relation to the full-size bow. Hands grow approximately in the same proportion to the arm, and we should see this in the bow design as well. So here are the arm growth ratios for male children. Because these calculations show that children of both genders and ethnicities grow proportionally, it strongly suggests that the violin bow dimension should increase in relation to the child size as they increase in age. To calculate ideal bow length measurements, the smallest proportion of the bone length was subtracted from 1. The value of the radius, humerus, and ulna remained the same for both female and male children at 0.56. This number was divided by 6, which is the number of differences between the sizes of bows, and this decimal was then distributed equally for each bow size, beginning at 0.56 and ending at 1. These values were multiplied by 72, which is the standard value for the total bow length. So this is the graph of the current bow length at each size. Now we'll show you what we think the ideal bow length should be. As you can see, the bow manufacturers did a good job. The data reflects that the bow makers have prioritized the dimension of length compatible with the way children grow. It works out, but unfortunately, the rest of the measurements don't align with the trajectory of growth of children. Grip strength is strongly associated with height, weight, and gender in early childhood. At age 4, for girls, the dominant hand grip strength is about 5 kilograms. At age 14, for girls, the dominant hand grip strength is about 30 kilograms. The 14-year-old will most likely be using adult equipment. This data shows that the 14-year-old is about 6 times stronger than the 4-year-old. If the grip strength of the younger child is this much weaker, putting a heavy, clunky bow in its child's hands will affect performance and musical development. The measurement of bows should reflect the proportions. So if the adult bow weighs about 60 grams, the child bow should weigh about 10 grams. There are limitations to this proposal. The comparison of grip strength to bow size may not be applicable. The measurement of grip strength includes squeezing the hand with substantial force, while playing the violin does not operate on this understanding. The construction is also not taken into consideration. It may not be feasible to have a 10-gram bow. However, this study shows that adults are much more strong than children. To calculate ideal bow weight measurements, the smallest proportion of the bone was subtracted from 1. The value for both male and female children was the same at 0.14. This number was divided by 6, the number of differences between the sizes of bows, and this decimal was distributed equally for each bow size, beginning at 0.14 and ending at 1. These values were then multiplied by 60, which is the maximum weight of the full-size violin bow. So this is the graph of the current bow weight at each size. Just notice that these weights aren't much different. Now we'll show you what we think the ideal bow weight should be based on development of grip strength in children. As you can see, what we think the ideal bow weight should be is wildly different from current practice. This illustrates that violin bows are too heavy for the child's size, and it suggested that these ideal weight values be used to support the argument that standard violin bow weights are too heavy. If the bow manufacturers shrink each aspect of the bow, the weight will naturally decrease. After a review of research, standardized dimensions of fractional size violin bows should be reconsidered. These next few slides suggest experimental bow dimensions based on ratios from measurements held constant, also noted in blue. And the proportions that were calculated by dividing each number in blue by the full size dimension. The ratios, which are noted in red at the top, were then applied to the other measurements of the violin bows. We weren't sure which length would be a better measurement to use, so either the ferrule to tip or the full length, and it's debatable which length is more important, but we created charts based on both measurements, and the proposed dimensions are very similar regardless.
All right, so what we started to do was we have dreams anyway of creating an actual bow. And so we took the various sizes of violin bows and looked how they compare to the full-size violin bow. And we looked at the dimensions of length and we looked at the dimensions of weight. So this first chart, if you assume the weights of the current bows are correct, or ideal, maybe you would say, this is how we would adjust every other dimension that we measured. But as we said earlier in the talk, we think that bows are currently too heavy in the smaller sizes. So I don't think we're going to actually explore these particular dimensions. These dimensions are from the ferrule to this tip, or in other words, what the length of the bow hair would be on the playing surface. And then the other set of dimensions that we created were the total length of the bow going from the end of the screw to the tip. And you'll notice that between the two, it doesn't really matter too much which ones we end up choosing because they are approximately the same. So here you can just take a second to look at these dimensions. This is the ferrule to tip, so the length of the playing surface of the bow. And then these are the total length of the bow.
Because children grow proportionally, it's recommended that bows be designed in a way that is more proportional to the hands that are controlling it. The bow that is most suited to the growth patterns of children is presumably a mixture of all of these proposed measurements. Our proposed measurements are based purely on sizing of children, and there are structural reasons not considered. All bows, regardless of size, are approximately 8 millimeters wide at the thickest point. We're proposing that the width of the stick go down to about 5 millimeters for the smallest size bows. This may not hold up structurally and the bow may snap. There are also cost and efficiency reasons that aren't considered. The student violin bows cost roughly between $40 and $100. At that price point, it may not be possible for the manufacturer to tailor each dimension to the children's proportions. From our measurements, all screws were the same size, and it may be cheaper to create one standard size screw for all bows. This will affect the feel of the bow, but nevertheless, it may be a necessary flaw in the bow design because of economic reasons. Looking at equipment we're using is a fundamental question. How do we alter the violin and other parts of equipment to make more sense in regard to our physical development as well as the musical development in children? For future study, we have planned to commission violin bows based on our experimental dimensions and study the effect when used by children. Thank you for your time, and we'll open up for questions and discussion.
Somebody asked us to send them a reference, I see, and we're going to ask If you could send me an email, we can get you that reference. We don't have that readily available on these slides. My email is just zachary.eben@vanderbilt.edu, and we'd be happy to send that on to you.
Any other questions? You can either unmute yourself to ask a question or put it in the chat.
Hi, Zach and Marie Faith. I had a question. I'm curious, given that you're thinking of commissioning bows that would adhere more closely to these optimum dimensions, do you have predictions about what the impact of that would be? You talked about the consequences of an inappropriate bow, but do you have specific predictions about playing or about biomechanical outcomes?
We're I mean, it's hard to say, you know. We're hoping that, in particular, I think advanced bow stroke development will be easier. I think that's kind of an easy one. Things like off the string playing, that sort of thing. We're also hoping something that comes up again and again when we have particularly advanced young children is the quality of the sound. That the violins, they kind of sound, even with a kid that plays particularly well, the sound quality has a certain roughness to it, that we're wondering if that's related to the thickness of the ribbon of the bow hair. That if you take a 8 millimeter wide ribbon of bow hair and put it on a violin string that is so much smaller, and the length of the string between the bridge and the nut is so much smaller, we're wondering if we could get rid of some of that roughness and make a more beautiful tone. But, you know, we'll see.
Oh,
I
great.
will tell you, as an interesting sort of, when we, in our very first stages of the project, we approached a few bow makers to try to find out what kinds of things they might think about if they were designing smaller violin bows. And the general consensus from the ones we approached was that they were completely and totally uninterested. That they were so very much focused on producing excellent quality full-size violin bows, and they had no interest in creating something small that you could buy from a factory for $40.
Mm-hmm. So you think a motivating factor there is compensation, that they're trying
I
to.
think so, and I think it's also, I think, a sense of the bow maker as an artist. You know, they want to produce something that a high-level professional violinist is going to use. They're not as interested in the kinds of things we might be interested in. But we'll see.
That's great food for thought. Thank you. We do have a question that came in from Ruth asking whether you have a timeline for these hypothetical fractional bows.
Well, I don't know if your universities are like ours, but my budget just got slashed. We are told that our budgets will recuperate following the virus, so that's going to unfortunately play a large part in it. And then it kind of depends on if we can find a bow maker that becomes interested in working with us. But hopefully by next year.
If I may, this is Mary Moser. I don't know where I am in the picture of things in the web. It seems like that it actually produces even more questions. Thinking a small bow, a thinner stick, when you hear people when creating sticks, even full-size sticks, the fractional sticks, thinner stick, the quality of the stick, finding Pernambuco, or Brazil wood. Brazil wood is so easy to snap. So I can understand why bow makers would find an element of frustration to find that size to cut and then bend, and then the number of sticks to then snap. And then just the quality, right? The artistry of doing that with the number of hairs. Because while we focus so much on the violin, you're right, not enough people focus on the bow, and that stick is also an artwork. not only in, of course, our creation of the sound, but the stick itself. And I'm thinking, like you were saying, the screw having it one size. And as you know, looking at all those compartments of the frog itself, when anybody has to replace a frog, the expense. So then the creation, I mean, it's talking about a whole new industry in creating that. So it's not even just the stick, forget the hair, but the tips. And every little aspect of creating that frog is new. It's a new industry. It's a whole new business to create that. So I wonder if it's not even talking to bow makers that exist now, but essentially talking to a new generation of bow makers, you know, that are interested in this venue.
Um, I think for sure. I have a suspicion if we have any success going forward in this, we're probably looking at some sort of artificial material, like carbon fiber or fiberglass, one of those types of things. I'm not an engineer though, so I can't tell you if the measurements we're proposing are going to work at that size. There are some experimental woods out there. I recently played on a bow that was made out of ipe, which is an African wood, which was neat. It's not as good as my other bows, but you know, maybe there's something out there. Um,
Well, and children grow really fast.
that's right. That's right. And also, I don't know about the other teachers here, but in my experience, violins can be repaired and bows get trashed. That's you know, that's the nature of the instruments tend to be pretty sturdy even when they're dropped and banged, and the bow's one bang in the wrong direction and it's gone. Um,
Yeah, I mean, they're not even worth rehairing.
yeah. So
It's almost a disposable product, which
yeah,
it's a little painful to say. It's almost like strings.
yeah. Um, so you know, we'll see. I do have some makers in mind. That we've started sort of very basic conversations with. I'm not sure if I should divulge who they are yet, um, but but we'll see.
And in your study, did you find any historical examples of properly proportioned fractional bows? That's a question we have from Kenneth.
We haven't, but to be honest, we haven't really looked historically speaking.
Well, we
Uh,
read that. Well, I read the book about like bow making, the
mhm.
history of bow making, and what has basically happened is they kind of figured out like this setup, and the changes over time has just been just like on the face like value. It hasn't been like to the actual dimensions or anything. It's more about like the way appearance and the way it looks.
Okay. We're going to have to stop our questions right there, and so we have time for our last presenter. But again, the proceedings and the contact information for all of the presenters are in our proceedings book on IRSTE.org, so you can go there and find everyone's contact information. So thank you very much, Zach and Marie Faith. We appreciate your very interesting presentation. So next on our agenda is mindfulness for musicians, bringing sport psychology and mindfulness-based therapies into the practice room and the concert stage. This will be presented by Loretta M. Werner. And Loretta, can you come to the floor?
Hi, everyone.
Let's see. There we go.
Can everyone see my screen okay? Okay. Hi, I'm Loretta Werner, and I'm the Assistant Professor of Music and Strings at Longwood University. And I've been a registered Suzuki violin teacher for the past 7 years. And my topic today is on mindfulness for musicians, bringing sports psychology and mindfulness-based therapies to the practice room and the concert stage. Before I begin my lecture, I want to take a moment to define mindfulness because there are many misconceptions surrounding the definition of mindfulness today. My definition comes from John Kabat-Zinn, who was the pioneer of bringing mindfulness into Western medicine. Mindfulness is defined as purposefully and non-judgmentally paying attention to the present moment, developing awareness of emotions, thoughts, and sensations, and acknowledging the reality of one's experience. I wanted to take a moment to give you a brief background behind my inspiration behind this topic. In 2014 and through 2016, I was pursuing my master's degree in Suzuki pedagogy at Ithaca College. And there I conducted a qualitative research study on anxiety and stress in musicians. And I interviewed about 25 participants, asking these musicians how they experience anxiety and stress in their everyday lives as a musician, how they cope with it, and how they observe it in their peers. After this, I started my doctoral degree in violin at West Virginia University, and I was interested in evolving with this topic of anxiety and stress and changing it slightly. And I was connected with two sports psychologists at West Virginia University, Dr. Ed Etzel and Dr. Lee Scavarla. Dr. Etzel is a sports psychologist, licensed psychologist, professor emeritus at West Virginia, and he also won the Olympic gold medal in riflery in 1984. And Dr. Lee Scavarla was a student of Dr. Etzel's. She's a sports psychologist and licensed counselor with the University of Pittsburgh student athletes. She was also a ballerina for many years and explores the topic of perfectionism with dancers. Through my connection with these two individuals, I was able to offer my perspective as a musician and how we experience very high stress situations frequently. And they offered me many sports psychology publications and mindfulness-based therapies from the psychology world. And through reading this, I realized how effortlessly musicians can adapt these practices into their everyday lives. And I was curious as to why there aren't many publications that focus explicitly on this. What I noticed is that mindfulness was at the forefront of all of these publications. And so I completed my dissertation on this topic last year. Since then, I've presented this material at various institutions, and I continue to delve into this topic. Here's a very general outline of publications and resources and topics that I consulted in my research. You see, I consulted sport and exercise psychology publications, mindfulness and medicine publications, music education resources. I also consulted very specific topics that focus and have mindfulness at the forefront of them, such as perfectionism and acceptance. And finally, I consulted two resources that are most like my topic, although there are some differences. I consulted Don Green's Performance Success. And those of you who aren't familiar with Don Green, he's a sports psychologist who offers peak performance training to world-class musicians and athletes. And he taught a class at Juilliard for many years where he impacted Noah Kageyama, who created an online platform and course called The Bulletproof Musician. Both of these resources were very valuable for my research, but what I noticed is that both of these resources focused quite a bit on peak performance. And I was much more interested in how a musician can incorporate sports psychology models and mindfulness-based therapies into their practice sessions, rehearsals, and everyday lives to enhance their performance. In my research, I asked myself these three questions that guided my research. Number one, how can cultivating mindfulness help musicians cope with intense emotions that arise during practice sessions, rehearsals, and performances? Number two, before I read this question, I do want to mention that all of the topics I discuss in this question are topics that I came across in my anxiety and stress research and through reading at my own leisure. And what I notice is that these topics or these factors combined with mindfulness very frequently. So number two, how can cultivating mindfulness help musicians develop psychological flexibility, nurture acceptance, soften perfectionism, calm the inner critic, and experience a state of flow? I recognize that not everyone may be familiar with psychological flexibility or flow. Psychological flexibility is defined as the ability to contact the present moment more fully. And a state of flow is something that I'll discuss a little bit later in this lecture. And finally, what kind of mindfulness-based models and exercises can musicians utilize during practice sessions, rehearsals, and performances? So let's explore the first question. How can cultivating mindfulness help musicians cope with intense emotions that arise during practice sessions, rehearsals, and performances? First, understanding physiological responses to intense emotions like anxiety, fear, panic, and worry may help musicians cope with these experiences. Jeffrey Brantley, who is a psychologist, meditation teacher, and author of Calming Your Anxious Mind, emphasizes that the physical experience is deeply interconnected with the psychological and emotional experience. And he encourages individuals to understand how these intense emotions manifest physiologically in their bodies. So for example, anxiety. Anxiety produces feelings of dread and foreboding, and it's a common emotion that we all feel at some point. Its physiological response consists of feelings of agitation, nausea, dizziness, chest pain, difficulty breathing. So why is this important? Well, this leads me to the next point. Practicing mindfulness can help musicians better understand how their bodies respond to a specific motion during high stress events. For example, before musicians realize how anxious and worrisome they are, they may recognize in their bodies that they're not breathing fully with their bellies, or they may notice a tightness in their chests. And when musicians become mindfully aware of their physiological responses, they can appropriately and effectively find ways to cope with these emotions before they become chronic or before they develop unwise emotional responses like avoidance or elaborate rituals. Moving on to my second question, how can cultivating mindfulness help musicians develop psychological flexibility, nurture acceptance, soften perfectionism, calm the inner critic, and experience a state of flow? First and foremost, mindfulness encourages individuals to stay in the present moment. And for all of these factors and these topics listed, staying in the present moment is a crucial component. Mindfulness helps musicians let go of thoughts, worries, and physical sensations and return to the present moment. When musicians accept their present moment reality, they act on their emotions, thoughts, and experiences in a constructive manner. Number two, mindfulness embraces the ability to practice discernment instead of judgment. I'd like to take a moment to define discernment and judgment and give you an example of this. So discernment is associated with a clear, open-minded perspective, while judgment is associated with a closed-minded, reactive perspective. So for example, I recently had a poor performance. If I was to practice judgment, these sort of thoughts and words would come up in my mind. I'm a horrible performer. What am I doing on stage? This piece was way too hard for me. And this is an example of me practicing discernment. That was a poor performance because I didn't get adequate practice time with my pianist. The second movement, I rushed, and in the first movement, my intonation suffered in the opening section. Discernment doesn't sugarcoat the situation, it still accepts the situation for what it is, but it doesn't identify the situation with the individual. And this is crucial for developing mindfulness, and it's also crucial for developing all of these topics, particularly calming the inner critic and softening perfectionism. And finally, mindfulness embraces deep focus, concentration, and being completely engrossed in an activity. This is particularly important when we need to experience a state of flow. And for musicians, experiencing a state of flow is ideal. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who's the leading expert on flow, defines flow as a subjective state that people report when they are completely involved in something, to the point of forgetting time, fatigue, and everything else but the activity itself. Attention is fully invested at the task at hand, and the person functions at his or her fullest capacity. As musicians, we all desire a state of flow to have effective practice sessions, joyful and efficient rehearsals, and completely engrossing performances. And finally, what kind of mindfulness-based models and exercises can musicians utilize during practice sessions, rehearsals, and performances? There are quite a bit from the psychology and sports psychology worlds. For coping and dealing with intense emotions that may arise during practice, rehearsal, and performances, musicians can consult two psychology models, MBSR and MBCT. MBSR, or mindfulness-based stress reduction, was developed by John Kabat-Zinn, and it utilizes mindfulness to reduce suffering, stress, and pain. MBCT, mindfulness-based commitment therapy, was developed by psychologists Siegel, Williams, and Teasdale. And this combines MBSR with cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's designed for individuals who experience anxiety, depression, and other type of disorders. There are many models that focus on developing the following topics. The acceptance commitment therapy, or ACT model, developed by Stephen Hayes, reduces unnecessary suffering through acceptance, defining one's values, and taking committed action. And in my dissertation, I went through this therapy model specifically along with the MAC model, and I reinterpreted each of the steps for this therapy model. Mindfulness Acceptance Commitment Model, MAC model, was developed by sports psychologists Gardner and Moore, and it combines ACT with MBCT, and it focuses on integrating mindfulness into an athlete's regimen, non-judging approach, and being in the present moment. These two models specifically focus on developing psychological flexibility and nurturing acceptance. Mark Coleman, the founder of the Mindfulness Training Institute and author of Make Peace with Your Mind, presents a discussion on discernment over judgment, which helps calm the inner critic. In Performance Success by Don Green, he offers a model for finding acceptance during a performance or a high-stress situation. Brene Brown, social worker, lecturer, and author, in her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, she offers a perfectionism versus healthy striving self-talk model. And Csikszentmihalyi discusses the very specific factors that need to be in place for someone to experience flow. And finally, I found numerous exercises from the psychology and sports psychology worlds that embrace mindfulness that musicians can use in their everyday lives. I want to pay special attention to the sleep, caffeine, and alcohol habits. These were influenced from a book called Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. And the more I bring up this book, the more and more it's becoming recognized, which is pretty amazing. But this book had a really big impact on myself. And I recognized that when I improved my sleep habits and I reduced my caffeine and alcohol intake, my musical output improved immensely. They say that 8 hours, everyone says 8 hours is the amount of sleep you need. Well, there's a reason for that, and he goes through why that is. So to conclude my lecture today, once again, in reinterpreting these sports psychology models in these mindfulness-based therapies for musicians is a very limited research topic. But I recognize that through my research, these sort of models can be so valuable for musicians to utilize and incorporate due to the profession's competitive nature, time-consuming demands, and frequent evaluations. In the future, I would love to conduct some sort of study in which I work with individuals or students, and we go through these models and these exercises in their music study and see if that affects their musical output. This is a small list of publications that I referenced today, although I have referenced much more in my research. I wanted to take a moment to thank IRSTE Online for inviting me to present today and also for providing this really amazing virtual event. And now, with the time we have left, I'd be happy to answer any questions. And please feel free to send me an email if you have any other questions or concerns, or if you'd like to read my dissertation, I'd be happy to send it to you. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Loretta? One of the things at least as a teacher, I think it's so important to teach some of those mindfulness techniques right from the beginning with our young students, so they're not learning them as a reaction or how to fix, but they grow up with that. And I think that's really, you make some very excellent points.
Absolutely. And in my document, in my dissertation, I offer a mindfulness for musicians course that I designed for undergraduate students, but you can really redesign this for any age of student. And all of these practices, as you said, are things that I do incorporate in my young students, particularly the discernment versus judgment exercise. I think it's important for a young student to walk away from a performance and in a very objective way say what went well and what can I improve, instead of that was awful, I hated that performance. So you really can implement this at any age.
Yes, it's great. Lots of people want to read your dissertation.
Awesome. Well, I'm happy to send it.
Great. Any other questions for Loretta?
I'll also put my email back in the chat box as well.
Well, let's give another virtual hand to all the presenters this evening. We're so happy to have had all of you, and we've learned so much and are going away with lots to think about. And then I would like to remind all of you that on Friday, 9 o'clock Pacific time, 12 o'clock Eastern time, we'll have a 90-minute session with Dr. Beatrice Ilari, who will speak about does participation in formal music education programs enhance children's pro-social skills. So there'll be some time. Again, she's the only presenter. That'll be our keynote. We'll have time for questions and answers with Dr. Ilari and discussion. So I hope that you'll be able to join us. Again, all of these presentations are being recorded, and you'll be able to find them on our website, on the SAA website, and they will also be emailed to you. The links will be emailed to you sometime Saturday or Monday, somewhere in there. Okay, so if you missed anything or had to come in late, you'll be able to catch it all on the weekend. And Kate, am I missing anything that you can think of?
Pat, I think that was it. To anyone who has questions, you can scroll back through the chat. There are a number of links, and some people have provided their contact information. Thank you to all of today's presenters, and thank you to those of you who stayed on the line for 2 full hours on an evening like this to join in this conversation tonight.